The title of the session is Industry Perspectives, Securing the Federal IT Ecosystem, which is certainly no easy feat. We've gathered some of the leading minds in industry to share their knowledge and expertise related to optimizing security in the many areas that keep federal CISOs up at night. Moderating this panel is Param Eftekhari, our EVP and co-founder. So I'll hand it off to Param.
Thank you, Jessica, and congratulations, you guys made it. It's an important feat. Our Mondays are pretty long, so well done. Very excited about this session. We're going to go ahead and kick things off. First, a quick introduction. To my left is Dan Karianis, who's the Director of Federal Sales at RSA. His left, Gary Rogers, Senior Vice President of Sales at Accellion. And to my far left is Matt Herr, the Senior Director of Product Management at Centrify, Inc. And to kick things off with, I'm going to ask each of you to just give a 1-minute overview as who you are and what you do. And start by just to give the audience a feel for your perspective on this issue. If you could tell us what you think the biggest challenge is that the agencies face when it comes to securing this new, ever complicated IT infrastructure.
Okay. Well, good afternoon. So Dan Karianis, I'm with RSA, run our federal division, and I've been with RSA for a few years as a result of an acquisition of Archer. So many of you have heard of maybe the Archer acquisition. RSA has been a little bit of a tear recently, doing a lot of acquisitions over the time, bringing them into a much broader security solutions portfolio. I think in second comment there was just in terms of the challenge. It's a big challenge. I mean, you have budget pressures, out in industry as we solicit your business and look to support you in your mission. One of the challenges you have is ongoing budget pressures, trying to get more done with less, and I think it's going to get worse. The good news for something like what RSA Archer is about is we get to leverage a lot of the information that your systems are already providing and help you from a GRC perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I get a chance to try to help make your lives a little more efficient in a very, very difficult environment. With all the threats that you have as well, we know that's an ongoing challenge. It's getting worse. And a trend that we don't think is going to go away. So how can we help support you in your mission and help you do a better job doing that? So look forward to talking about that some more.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So good afternoon. I'm Gary Rogers. I'm the Senior Vice President of Worldwide Sales with Accellion. Accellion is a FIPS-certified secure file sharing solution for both desktop-to-desktop file sharing as well as desktop-to-mobile device file sharing. It's used by many, many government agencies, federal government agencies, as well as governments around the world, from be it as close as Canada to Australia, London, throughout Europe, and so forth. We are growing very quickly in the space, and primary reason has to do with this biggest challenge that's facing federal agencies. My view of the biggest challenge facing you? That. Right? It's the consumerization of IT. And it's going to affect everybody's job. It's going to affect the way you do business. And I think that being proactive and getting out ahead of it is going to be the answer to the question, how do I deal with that?
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Matt Herr. I'm Senior Director of Product Management for Centrify Corporation. What Centrify does is really focus on being able to unify and centralize identity policy as it spans mobile devices, as it spans applications, whether they be on-premise or in the cloud, and as it spans where our roots began, in the data center, in very heterogeneous environments. Now, when I think about some of the biggest challenges, I mean, there are a number, and my colleagues here certainly mentioned some very important ones. When I think about challenges going forward, I tend to think, we're facing the same challenges we faced before. They're just magnified. And they're being magnified by some very big trends. Gary mentioned mobility, or bring your own device, right? So on the one hand, we have a very diverse, very heterogeneous environment and very uncontrollable kind of environment coming up on the endpoints. But on the other hand, we also have resources that are very dynamic as well. And you're seeing this with notions like cloud bursting or being able to host services or put infrastructure into the cloud. And so I think a key challenge, and from an identity perspective, is really around how do you maintain centralized control and centralized visibility in an environment that is so dynamic and is changing under our feet? And how do you do this in a way that is cost-effective without doing forklift upgrades?
Terrific, thank you. And Gary, I'm going to start with you. You mentioned the consumerization of IT, and one of the things that government always asks about is lessons learned from private sector. And I was wondering if you could share with us your thoughts on why that community has been able to quickly adopt Salesforce, iPad, and these types of cloud or mobile solutions, and how have they done so despite the security concerns?
Well, it's a good question, and I could tell you that we see quite a lot of it. Often folks come to Excellion after trying a consumerized file sharing solution. So, the one that I think the name everybody knows is Dropbox. Many people use it. You'd be surprised at the companies that have walked away from that and come to Excellion for a very secure solution. The reason is, of course, data breaches, right? Data breaches can be very costly to business. So how are private companies dealing with it? I think the same way the federal government has to deal with it. Simply, they are looking for a prescriptive architecture for secure mobility. What exactly are the pieces I need to have in place to put a secure mobile plan in place? So this relates to two things in general. One is, specifically, what are the IT solutions that I need to make that work? But the second part, and also equally important, particularly with the cloud, is what are your governance policies on these things? So you have to have policy and you have to have IT to work together. What you should not do is simply pick, something that, sounded like a good idea at the time, and run off with that. Start with the policy. How are you going to manage these files? Because that's the first thing, right? If you're going to share files, is wait a minute, who's sharing? With whom? What types of files? What is your document retention and destruction policy? And then does this support it? I will address specifically, there were two items you mentioned, cloud and mobile. When you look at cloud, clearly if you're going to a publicly available cloud, you need to look at the terms of service there. Because I think if you look at those terms of service, it's eye-opening. I will invite everybody to do one thing. We have quite a long break between here and dinner. So I'll give you time to go back to your room. For a laugh, go back, go to Google, and look at their terms of service. Google has the right to do all sorts of things with your content, including perform it, which I have to be honest, I really I'm not sure what that even means. but they felt it important to put it in there and tell you that they can do that with your content. So cloud vendors, you really ought to take a look at that one. When it comes to mobile, of course, how do you solve the thing with mobile? It's like I say, prescriptive architecture. It takes more than one simple solution. And I'll give you what's come out of the boardroom discussions we've had. People have been talking about MDM, and MDM is a very important part of that. But MDM protects the device. You also need to protect the content, because the content is going to go beyond your device or beyond your agency's devices. So you can buy MDM for all of your people, but not for the other guy's people. So you do need a content management solution as well as a mobile content management solution as well as an MDM. Okay.
Perfect. And Matt, some of the things that Gary just mentioned really have to do with the fact that the number of endpoints are increasing dramatically, and the information we access through those are becoming much more diverse. And from your perspective, what is the role of identity management in that whole process of keeping this all secure?
You're right. So, I think what's interesting, kind of expanding on a point I was making before around some of the major trends that we're seeing, with all this change, with all this kind of dynamic environment that we have at both endpoints and at resources, I guess a question that I would ask is, what are you controlling? What is going to be the cornerstone for being able to have any kind of control or visibility over this environment? And what I would propose is that the one thing that's going to be constant, is going to be super important for everyone here to look at in this changing environment, is identity. Because that is one thing that's going to be constant. One thing that I think is very important is that security policies follow the user life cycle, right? They don't follow a device life cycle. They don't follow a server life cycle. They follow a user as they progress through your organization, as they change job functions, or as they leave your organization. And so how are you going to manage that identity going forward? Now, I think that with some of these trends coming up, and I've said this to a few people that I've talked to earlier today, I've been around long enough to see some trends come and go, and to hear about the next new thing, right? And it seems like whenever there's the next new thing, there's a next new thing solution. And a lot of times the story goes, here's the next new thing, get in front of it, and just forget everything else you did. Here's the next new solution. And I think that one of the challenges we're going to have is kind of having the ability to see how to evolve the investments that we made, very strategic investments we made, so that we can address the next new thing in a way that is cohesive. Because if this stuff doesn't hang together, we're just going to end up creating multiple silos of identity or islands of identity, and that will cause problems.
Yeah, interesting. And, we're talking a lot about the challenges we face. Dan, I was wondering, what do you see agencies doing to respond and manage incidents, but also more importantly, as to many of the comments already made, how then are they taking those lessons learned and sharing them amongst other agencies?
So one of the things that we've seen within RSA is the whole notion of trying to share incidents across the enterprise. I mean, one of the challenges that you all have, and I mentioned budgets as an example earlier, you also have, in many cases, multiple domains, silos, component organizations, bureaus, and so sometimes the lack of willingness to share information across the enterprise is a real challenge. So one of the things that we've seen and what we've been kind of proposing and driving within a lot of our customers is the ability to create an environment where I can share really relevant information so that everybody can benefit across my enterprise with that information. In some of our customers' cases, quite candidly, they don't want the rest of the folks within the organization to know who got drilled today, but they do want to share the information. They do want people to know. In other organizations that use a lot of our tools, they want to be able to share it, and they're open to it. They're open to people understanding some of the challenges and waiting for that phone call to come from their companion, their comrade out in the West Coast, who maybe is running another division and asking a quick question because they're seeing the same thing on their network. They're seeing the same thing within their environment. So we're starting to see more sharing of environmental information around incidents, which is helping organizations try to mitigate them before they come their way. Another thing that we're seeing is the integration of tools like an incident management, case management solution like ours at Archers with typical ticketing systems. Many of our customers are they're not interested in sharing a lot of information around a breach of a significant, severe nature, but I certainly want to cause somebody to hurry up and do something. So we've integrated with various ticketing systems so I can have the analyst do the work, understand what's happening, share that information with the appropriate people, but I can also send information off to a ticketing system and cause someone to not have to worry about why they're doing something, but just to go fix something, and they need to fix something in a hurry, take responsibility for something, have ownership and accountability for that. So we're seeing a lot of those types of things occur within a lot of the federal clients that we work with. And quite honestly, with even the commercial market as well, we're seeing the same trend as well there.
Perfect. And Gary, last question before we move on to the next segment of this panel is really focused on consumer-oriented software and the fact that we talk a lot about devices, but there's also a trend right now that individuals want to use their consumer software in the work environment that obviously has risks. So what is your take on that?
Sure. The consumerization of IT is clearly it's a trend, and it is a potential threat. I mentioned before what I believe the answer is, that you need two things to that. Number one, you need policies, but number two, you need to provision something for it. So it is not enough to say you cannot do this. You need to say, don't do this, and supplement it with do that. Okay? So you must provision the solution that is the acceptable way to do whatever it is you're trying to address. So in our domain, where we talk about file sharing, the danger is people using a solution like Dropbox. Dropbox poses a problem in two ways. One, that people are sharing data and it's not encrypted. Okay, so for some of the agencies, I was talking with the VA earlier today and others, you've got, as an example, HIPAA data, personally identifiable information. It's simply, violation of policy to have that travel in an unencrypted manner. But the further problem is if you need to take someone down, if you say this person's no longer associated with the agency, they're a bad actor, they've done something, if they have a consumerized product, you have no ability to do that. You don't control their account. They have a personal account with Dropbox. You have no way to control that. Not only that, here's a further problem. When you share a file with any of these services and then they have others, that file, let's say, contains a spreadsheet or a Word document. They need to open it with a helper application. Often these helper applications have their own cloud as well. Maybe they have a note-taking application like Evernote. It's got its own cloud. So now your file is replicating and replicating and replicating. You've completely lost it. Okay? So there is only one solution to that, and that is policy alone won't work because it doesn't. I don't think everybody does everything they ought to do. So you need to provision something that will control that, and you can do that today.
Terrific. So the next segment, we're going to do kind of like the Sunday morning talk shows where they have the hot button issue, and then we get someone to talk about it. So Dan, I'm going to start with you. First one up is supply chain management. What are you hearing federal agencies talk about there?
Well, I don't know about you all. The session this afternoon I thought was pretty interesting. We run into supply chain quite a bit on the commercial side, and I'm hearing it more and more often now in the federal accounts and the federal marketplace. I mean, it's a real challenge if you kind of think about some of the discussion that you all heard earlier today. You have multiple levels or tiered vendors, and you've got a tier 1 vendor who's sourcing product and services from a tier 2 vendor who's sourcing it from a tier 3 vendor, and that ultimately is ending up in your agency. I mean, how are you assuring that all that stuff that you're acquiring is secure? And so one of the things that we've been trying to do is help people, at least in the assessment process, and I'll talk a little bit about risk mitigation, risk management in a little bit, but being able to at least automate the process of performing assessments against people that are providing you personnel resources to do work on site. So your primary contractors and their subs and the subs of the subs. How are you performing assessments against them to ensuring that they're living up to contractual requirements? I tend to agree with you. Sometimes, even if I've got policies in place, people sometimes just do things they shouldn't ought to do. And then also on the product side as well, if I've got a way to assess third-party vendors and have them provide meaningful information back to me. We were talking about that during our session earlier today, and how can we augment that process, make it more efficient so it occurs with frequency and consistency, and how it can also basically use a risk scoring methodology against it. So if I've got some concerns about certain vendors, maybe I might have a higher risk score associated with them, so I can really start to manage that process and try to get a hold of and manage the vendors that support me from a supply chain perspective. But it is a difficult problem. It's going to get worse. We, even within RSA, we have a supply chain office. We have an individual that heads it up. If you think about the products and solutions we bring to market, that is their responsibility to perform assessments, to do inspections on site at those various organizations to ensure that what we bring to market, quite honestly, is secure. But we have the same concerns that many of you do.
Terrific. Gary, next one's for you. That's BYOD. We know that it's obviously one of the hottest issues right now. What are your take on that?
Take on BYOD? Well, yeah, it is very hot. I could tell you in the commercial world, it's probably the de facto policy of most organizations we walk into. And they're simply dealing with it. But I'll share a quick little case study with you, if I can, of an organization that you all know, Verizon Wireless. Verizon Wireless had 100,000 people they considered road warriors, And it's an interesting organization because they provision mobile devices to many of their employees, but in addition, they also have a BYOD policy. Now, what goes on there, you could picture if you're a Verizon salesperson working in a retail store, you have people from all the device manufacturers coming by and leaving you things to try, right? And you've got them all. I would laugh when I'd go to the meetings. They would sit down, and it was like, if you remember the old movies of a poker game in the West where everybody would put their gun on the table, these guys would empty like 3, 4, 5 devices on the table and sit down to talk. What Verizon wanted was differential permissions depending on whether it was a company provision device or a BYOD device. So if you are looking at a BYOD policy yourself, I think that is something to consider, to say, if you've got a device you have brought to work, what am I going to allow you to do there? So one is policy, and then the next is, do I have an IT solution that will support the ability to have differential permissions on that? Okay?
Interesting. Matt, next issue is for you. It's on data center consolidation. We all know that efficiency, we heard yesterday, or maybe earlier today, I can't recall, that doing more with less is going to happen very, very soon here. Given your background in identity, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how identity plays a role in consolidation efforts.
Well, sure. You know, I guess what I would say is, with a big initiative around data center consolidation, treat it as an opportunity from an identity policy management perspective. Treat it as an opportunity. It's an opportunity to kind of clean things up. I mean, I have dealt with a number of different customers who have legacy, for lack of a better term. Another way of putting this would be to say they have many islands of identity. For example, we've seen this in a data center with Unix, Linux systems. You know, I've talked to a few of you today about this as well. An example might be, I have 1,000 Unix machines, and the identity on these machines is managed by an etc password file. How do you consolidate that? You know, I mean, there are tools you can use, and I'm glad to say that we provide some of them. But there's an opportunity here with data center consolidation to start consolidating these islands of identity. And I think that this is something that is a pattern to keep in mind as well as you look at other platforms and address some of these other trends. Because these islands of identity occur not just in a data center, but also when you talk about how you're going to manage your SaaS applications, how you're going to manage your mobile devices, or how you're going to manage them in conjunction. The more islands of identity you create, I think the harder it is to apply policies that are so important. The other thing that I would suggest is take advantage of data center consolidation to unify and consolidate, let me put it this way, to make consistent your authorization, your access control policies. Once you can start bringing together your identity infrastructure, you have the opportunity to bring together a consistent policy. Now, when you do that, it's going to make your life simpler across the board, right? Because you're not doing translation, you're not doing mapping. And when an auditor comes calling and is asking, what is your access policy for Joe, you can say, here it is, and it applies across these servers in the data center, it applies across the mobile devices that he is using, and it applies across the SaaS applications that he's accessing, whether that be through a web browser or through these mobile devices as well. So, I guess my main thought here is treat this as an opportunity. Now, one consideration, I think, as you're consolidating your data center is, how can you leverage your existing investments? And I just pose that as a question, right? Because I think it would be a mistake, and I kind of alluded to this before, I think it would be a mistake to think that that data center consolidation or a new initiative means let's throw things out, here's a chance to start over. I think the thing to think about is, how do you guys have spent years, I'm sure, making decisions, making choices, planning rollouts, planning deployments of your existing infrastructure. Probably works pretty well. So a question to ask again, as I'm consolidating my data centers, I'm consolidating my identity infrastructure, as I'm unifying my access policies, my identity policies, is how do I do this in a way that allows me to take an evolutionary approach rather than doing something that amounts to a forklift upgrade?
Well, so far, I think there's a theme here, and all the answers is simplify, simplify, simplify. We'll see if that theme continues. Dan, continuous monitoring. We know that conceptually what that means, but when you dig down a little bit, everyone has different definitions in terms of frequency, how to do it, when to do it, et cetera. I'm wondering what's your take on that?
So this is an area that's kind of near and dear to our heart within the Archer division of RSA. I mean, this is kind of core to what we do to support the federal marketplace from a continuous monitoring, governance, risk, compliance perspective. So share a couple thoughts with you. First off, I think the definition really depends on who's deciding what it should really mean. I mean, there are folks who really are trying to move this from every 3 years to every 3 months to every 3 weeks to every 3 minutes to every 3 seconds. I mean, so what is continuous monitoring for you? Well, I think a lot of that really depends on, in some respects, your infrastructure and your ability to actually bring information into an environment so I can monitor with some level of frequency. A lot of the organizations that we work with, we were trying to help them leverage the existing, so I love the comment you made earlier, they'll leverage the existing infrastructure and solutions, tools that you've already deployed and get maximum value out of those. I mean, that's a big value proposition. I mean, let's be honest, it's not like you guys are coming into a lot more money here to buy new tools next year, right? So the big opportunity here is to leverage what you have, but do it in a much more consistent manner so that I can provide meaningful visualization of the information on a consistent manner, get that information in front of people so they can make risk-based decisions on it, and they can take action on it. So for us, and the Tripwire discussion today at lunch was kind of hitting home for me. I view Tripwire like an ArcSight, like a McAfee, like a Symantec. They're information sources for a tool like an organization like ours. We want to be able to raise that information up into the organization so the right people get to see the right information at the right time. It's got some statistical or risk-based scoring associated with it, so they can start to make decisions about what they need to deal with immediately versus maybe over time. I mean, if you think about it from a continuous monitoring perspective, if I was looking at it every 3 hours, and as a result of the new report I'm looking at, I've got 1,000 things that are broken. Where do I start? What do I do first? And so that, to me, is a lot of not only the visualization piece, but the risk scoring piece comes into this, so I can help an organization make sense from a continuous monitoring perspective of the information they have in front of them, what needs to really get dealt with first, and kind of move from that point of time forward. Because you don't have enough resources to do everything. So I think we heard that this morning. So you really need to focus on the things that matter most, and mitigate risk in those things, and manage the risk in those other areas as you kind of move on down the path. So to me, it's a lot of it is leveraging what you have in-house, creating an environment where I can bring all that information into a kind of a unified structure where different levels of the organization can see it, can understand it, and based on what their role is in the organization, do something about it. And that's really what continuous monitoring means.
Terrific. And the last issue before we go to our closing remarks is related to integration of on-premise and off-premise users and resources. That's something we keep, maybe not that specifically, but it keeps coming up in theme here. Matt, I was wondering your thoughts on what are the stumbling blocks and how we can overcome that.
Yeah, well, if you think about, I feel like almost a little bit like a broken record because I realize I'm saying some very consistent things, but I guess that's a good thing at least. I'm not contradicting myself. When we look at on-premise and off-premise, I think this is just another way of saying we have some very major trends that are impacting the way we need to run and manage our infrastructure. And, I'll come back to a few things. One is, how do you achieve consistency? So if you're looking at on-premise, off-premise resources, so data center, cloud resources, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, application as a service, what have you. On one hand, if you look at your devices, your mobile devices, your iPads, your iPhones, your laptops are changing, right? I mean, why wouldn't I view my MacBook as a mobile device? It really kind of is. The user experience is going to be very different for these types of devices. The user experience, as alluded to before, for the applications is a very different experience, right? We have people who can go down to Best Buy and buy an iPhone and start checking their email. Because why? Because ActiveSync is on by default and you can just use a username and password. We have organizations that can subscribe to SaaS services and completely bypass some of the controls that IT might have in place in some circumstances, right? So I think a real key challenge here is how to make this end user experience very easy, because at the end of the day, the business processes, the work we do on a daily basis revolves around that end user. And how do we do this in a way that is consistent across our existing infrastructure and this new infrastructure that we're moving towards? And so a few things come to mind. One is, again, what is your existing infrastructure? And can you tie your on-prem and your off-prem infrastructure together using this consistent infrastructure? Or are you going to go down a path and say, well, let's just stand up some separate way to manage my cloud infrastructure. Let's stand up some separate way to manage my mobile devices. Or how about this one? Let's stand up a way to manage my mobile devices independent of my SaaS applications. Now, that puzzles me a bit because if I think about how I access most of my SaaS applications, I'm doing it through a mobile device. So I think there's a lot of consistency type of concerns that we should be addressing. And these are going to be real challenges moving forward.
Perfect. Well, brings us to the end of this session. I just, in closing, want to ask each of you if you could just summarize for us. We talked about a lot of different issues and challenges and solutions, but if you want the folks here to walk away with one key takeaway, what would that be? And Dan, we'll start with you.
I'd say, first off, it'd be maximize all the existing infrastructure, tools, and systems you already have today, and try to leverage those in a more cohesive manner across the entire enterprise where I'm actually sharing information. I mean, again, the comment I said at the outset, within the federal space, I mean, it's not getting any easier for you, particularly from a financial and from a budgetary perspective. So how do I do more with the same? How do I do more with less? And so the whole notion of continuous monitoring is driving us to do more frequent review of our environment, at the same time enhancing a level of security, but be able to leverage our existing environments to do that. So to the extent that you're looking for something to do that, try to find something that's going to help you leverage everything you have within your enterprise and bring all that information into one environment where you can start to make real risk-based decisions.
Perfect. Gary?
Well, I think that when we look at the trends today, both in IT and just in society, the mobile apps, the mobile devices, and the consumerized applications that people are using are here to stay. These are things that we're all going to have to address. I think if you were to look at the adoption of the iPad compared to previous technologies from Apple, as an example, look at the iPhone, look at the iPod, you think of how hot they were when each one of them came out. The iPad is outstripping them 1,000 to 1 in terms of the adoption. This is not, it may be today to you, but I am telling you in a year or so, this is not just something that a few executives will have. Everybody's going to be carrying these things. Everybody's going to be using them. These consumerized apps people are going to be using. So what it does is it creates a shadow IT. In a sense, a shadow IT organization in your organization, if you let it. So to bring it full circle to the things I've said before and that Matt and Dan have been saying, they've been talking about leveraging your existing infrastructure. I think that's very important where you can. They've talked about the implementation of a solution and making sure you make the right decision. And of course, that's always important, right? Decisions are important to us in terms of our career and in terms of having the right solutions out there. But in a world where things are changing as quickly as they are, where technologies are changing, where people are introducing into the workplace things that we had not seen before. People used to simply, kind of knock on that glass room wall, and that's where their IT came from. Not anymore. They're bringing it with them. And the newest generation of people entering the workforce, they expect it. They demand it. So what are we to do? How do we mitigate risk in a world like that? And I think the answer is it starts with a single word. It starts with agility. Make sure that the solution you're purchasing gives you some agility, that it does not lock you in to one simple way of doing things. It could be a single platform. It could be someone selling you a rip and replace solution for what you have. Be careful of that. Leverage your existing infrastructure where you can. That'll minimize your costs and, of course, effectively continue the lifespan of what you have. Also, provision what you must provision to deal with the opportunity, but also the threats that are coming into the workplace with devices and with consumerized applications. So I think it's a challenge that all of us face, but I think clearly, meeting all of you, we've got the wherewithal, we've got the intelligence to deal with it effectively, but we do have to deal with it. This is not something that could wait. You need to get on it and do it.
Perfect. And Matt?
Yeah, so I first would like to agree with what Dan and Gary said. I think that's very sound and timely statements. Now, you said, what's the one thing that I would leave? And boy, so I decided on this answer because I think it gives me a loophole. The one thing that I would leave with you is remember your guiding principles. Okay, so now I get to say a bunch of guiding principles, do you see? And so I'll say this from an identity management perspective, identity policy perspective, really. There are best practices for better governance that I like to talk about, and I've mentioned these today. And I think that these form very good guiding principles as we go forward. It will help us also, I think, to apply some of the advice that we've gotten here today from these two gentlemen. One is, and I think this is probably the most important, is security policies follow the user. Security policies follow the user life cycle. I think that's something to keep in mind, something that's very important. Now, as we keep that guiding principle in mind, I think some of the best practices around better governance include the following. If you do not consolidate your identities, if you don't have a consistent way to look at, and I'll be more specific, authentication. What is my identity namespace? If I cannot get users to log in as themselves, how can I ever support principles like least privilege access, right? So I think the baseline for being able to have consistent policies and to be able to apply principles, right, that we all know, like separation of duties, like least privilege access, the first step has to be identity consolidation or unification. And this applies not just to your on-premise systems in your data center, but this applies to the mobile devices and applications being used going forward. Consistent identity, consistent authentication. The next step is to provide consistency in terms of the policies that are being applied to those identities. And so you might think of this as access control policies, for example, your authorization policies. And again, why do you need this type of consistency? Because at the end of the day, a user is not going to be limited to, in the past, to a terminal connected to one application running in your data center. A user is going to be using an iPhone or an iPad or a MacBook or a terminal, right? And might be connecting to your data center or to some service being run in the cloud. As you're progressing down this path, another guiding principle to keep in mind is you can't really say that you have covered the bases if you only have control but no visibility. So it's important to maintain visibility as you're going through this process. How are you going to audit? How are you going to monitor and understand that the policies you put in place are still in place, that those policies are being enforced, or from a forensic perspective, those policies have been applied as you expected them to be applied? And then the last thing that I would add here is that in order to be nimble, in order to be agile, one aspect of this is the ability to automate, right? So how can you integrate your infrastructure into new systems or new infrastructure? How can you reduce your costs and improve your efficiency by automating repetitive tasks and as a result, reduce your chance for errors? And how are you going to get to environments where you can start really orchestrating whole systems at a larger scale without that ability to automate? So I would say, my bottom line is, remember your guiding principles. To sum it up, just that one statement.
Those are all great points. That brings us to the close of the moderated portion of this session. We have a few moments left. Are there any questions from the audience members? The bar doesn't open for 2.5 hours, so you're not going to hold anyone up here. All right. Oh, yes, please.
So, Jan, you talked about lessons learned. You talked about lessons learned, and I probably have a caustic viewpoint that we do a fantastic job on lessons observed, but we never learn and we never react from it. Whether it's a natural catastrophe or it's a threat source that commits a heinous crime, dealing with your customers, are you having any success in any interagency or interorganizational collaboration where they're truly taking a lesson that one organization learned and putting actionable steps in place?
So I kind of alluded to earlier, I don't know if I can mention them by name, two federal agencies that I work with today, specifically in the area of incident management. Maybe I'll kind of talk to that first, where severe issues that they might have encountered at one location or another, one site or another. And they have a system in place, a process in place now to quickly share that information across their enterprise so that one individual's hard lesson is everybody else's lesson learned. So yeah, there are people that are doing it today. I don't see that as much as I think we should. I think part of this is the sometimes of political domains within a lot of the departments and agencies that we all might work for. It's just one of the challenges that we have. But I think at the same time, one of the things that we have seen is our ability to help cause more collaboration with a platform that we bring to market, so that it makes it easier for people to share and be able to quickly see information, have access to information, and to therefore draw people into the conversation. So more and more people are doing that. But it's not easy. I mean, there are some entities that are out there now that are trying to do this. We have a service, RSA has a service it provides in terms of the major threats that are out there in the marketplace, and there are other companies like iSight and otherwise that provide that kind of information. These are part of the lesson learns or things that other people have seen, and they're trying to get that out there. So we actually bring that into our environment so our customers can see that ASAP as soon as it's out, so that maybe they can deal with it before it turns into a real issue. But I'd like to say that you'd think that we'd be farther along in sharing, but I don't see that yet. But I do see some people move in that direction because they have to. I do want to say one question about the mobile stuff. I didn't get a chance to get it in. I have an opportunity. I have had the pleasure of working with a large commercial entity. You all know them by name. It's a 3-letter company. 100,000 plus, 200,000 plus employees. So they promote work from home. They realize that they spend somewhere in the order of $15,000 to $20,000 a year per employee every year for that employee having a homework space. So they are driving more homework. So the whole commentary about mobile app and your workers being, in remote locations, it's a big challenge, because they're not in your buildings. You can't have access to their systems as much as you'd like to. So I want to throw that in there because it gets back to the economics. Sometimes we're thinking, how do we save money? How do we become more cost effective? Well, in their particular case, well-respected entity, they're introducing more security risk now because of that. So.
Any other questions? All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.